We all know how a good, grim fairy tale starts, don't we? I'll remind you. Once upon a time, not twice, not 3 times, but once and once only, there stood 2 kingdoms. One was ruled by a king, the other by a queen. But these kingdoms, they had treaties, they had trade agreements, they had all the things that bind groups of people together. And so the king and the queen met, and they decided that should they be blessed with children, the firstborn would be betrothed to each other from the day of their birth. Now, sure enough, the king, after a few months, fell in love. He took a bride and she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. And the queen too. She had her head turned. She took a husband and she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. Now, unfortunately for these spouses, neither of them were destined to live too long, and so before long they passed away, leaving the king a widower and the queen a widow. But they both took solace in their children, and they loved them dearly. The princess grew up in the castle, and every day, every month, every year she seemed to grow in height, as small people do, in grace and in joy. And her mother took her aside when she was 10 and explained how she was going to be betrothed to the prince of the other land. And the little girl just nodded gravely and said, "All right, Mum, I understand." And then not long after she turned 18, her mother summoned her to the throne room, where she sat on her great golden throne, surrounded by her attendants. The princess was in a simple shift of green, her long golden hair cascading down her back, and she looked up at her mother expectantly. "It is time, my darling, for you to begin your great journey out of our kingdom to visit your betrothed. But I will not send you out unprepared. 3 things will I give you to help you on your way." And the queen clapped her hands, and the doors to the throne room were flung open, and in came a servant holding a beautiful grey horse. "This is Falada," said the queen, "the last of the great horses, the last of the talking horses. He may not speak often now, but when he does, heed his counsel. He has agreed to bear you swiftly and sure-footedly to your destination." The princess looked at Falada. Falada looked at the princess, and something passed between them. The princess ran up, flung her arms around his neck, and smiled, and the throne room lit up. And Falada, for his part, he leaned in, just ever so gently, ever so slightly. "Of course, the second thing, you must have a maid as befits your station," said the queen, and she began to look round at all the servants in her courtyard. Most of them shrunk back. They had lives, they had families, they didn't want to be sent off to some other kingdom. But one, a squat, dumpy little woman, stood up, tall as she could, and stared the queen right in the eye. "You," said the queen, "you will accompany my daughter, and you will help her however you may." And the servant bobbed a little curtsy and faded into the background. "And lastly, I give you this," said the queen, and she took out a box, a little smaller than that one, and from it she withdrew a piece of cloth as white as snow, as soft as silk, and a single silver pin. And with that pin she pricked her finger and squeezed. 1, 2, 3 drops of blood that blossomed on the cloth like scarlet flowers. She gave it to the princess, who tucked it up and popped it in her dress for safekeeping. "Take this," said the queen, "and wherever you go, no matter how far, my love and my blessing and my power will travel with you." And the princess nodded gravely. "Yes, Mama, I understand." And then she gave her mum the biggest hug that throne had ever seen. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. There were food to be packed, there was cakes to be baked, there were drinks and routes to be charted. But eventually, the princess on Falada, accompanied by her maid on a little donkey, rode out across the drawbridge of that castle, onto the long, winding road that led to the prince's kingdom. It was the height of summer, and the sun beat down, and the princess, well, she was a royal. She wasn't that used to being outdoors, and she soon found out that she could sweat. And she grew hot and thirsty, and she drained her water bottle, and still her throat got dry and itchy, and then she heard the tinkling of a stream nearby, and once it had hoved into view, she stopped and she turned to her maid and said, "Please, will you go and get some water for me from the stream so I might quench my thirst?" And the maid looked at her. "No." "All right," said the princess, "I'll do it myself." And she got off the horse, went to the stream, filled up her bottle and drunk it down, and it was the coolest, sweetest thing she had ever tasted. And once she was refreshed, they got back on and off they went. But still, the sun beat down, and she grew hot, and she grew sweaty, and she grew thirsty, and she drained that bottle, and her throat began to itch. But another stream came along, and she stopped, and she said to her maid, "Please, will you get some water from the stream so that I can quench my thirst?" And the maid crossed her arms. "We're not in your mother's kingdom now, princess. Do it yourself." "All right, I will," said the princess. And she went, and this time she didn't even bother with the bottle. She just crouched over and lapped up the water like a deer. But as she did so, that cloth tumbled out of her dress into the water. She went to reach for it, but suddenly the maid was there, gripping her hand, just making sure you're not falling into the water, your highness. And in that iron grip, the princess could not escape. She could only watch as it sailed off down the river and away. Once she was refreshed, she climbed back on her horse, and they carried on. And the sun beat down, she grew thirsty, drained her water bottle, found another stream, asked, "Please, will you get me some water from the stream?" "Not in this world, nor ever. Do it yourself." "All right, I will." The princess went down, she scooped up the water and she drank, and once she'd done, she turned round and there was the maid, right behind her, blocking her way. "Let me tell you how this is going to play out, girlie. You and I are going to swap clothes. I am going to ride your fancy horse, you can have my donkey, and when we get to the castle of your betrothed, I am going to marry him. And what's more, you are going to swear an oath that you will tell no living soul under the bright blue sky what happened here today, or it will go very, very badly for you." And the princess looked at the maid and remembered the steel in those fingers, and she thought she had no choice. "All right, I will." And they swapped clothes, and the princess got on the donkey, and she swore that she would tell no living soul under the bright blue sky what had occurred. And as she did so, the maid spat words, ancient words, words of dark magic, and the princess felt that oath settle on her like an iron coat. She looked at Falada for help. Falada looked back at her, and the horse opened his mouth. But he said nothing, staying silent for now. On they travelled, and before long they arrived at the prince's castle. It was a good, sturdy stone construction, festooned with flowers and ribbons of welcome, and the prince and the king were there, surrounded by servants to welcome them. The prince, in particular, was really looking forward to meeting his bride. But when they came round the corner and through the grate, the prince's eyes went wide. Not at either of the women, but at Falada, because the prince loved horses. he loved to ride, he loved to hunt. Sometimes he would sneak down to the stables in disguise and he would help out. And so he completely ignored both of the women as he thought, what a magnificent creature is in front of me. I wonder if I can take it out for a spin soon. And he didn't pay attention when the bride, the false bride, hopped off Falada, sashayed over it and said, "Watch your lover, I'm here to be your bride." Yes, of course, we'll be married tomorrow, said the prince. The king, however, he did notice, and he thought it was curious that this figure in the beautiful dresses on the magnificent horse was so interesting looking, while the servant was much more what he'd think of his child's type. And when he caught the eye of the princess, she opened her mouth to say what had happened, and nothing came out. So she shrank back into herself, and the king, not wanting to undermine his son's promise, said nothing, holding his peace. And so the next day, there was a wedding. There was feasting. There was drinking, there were acrobats, there was cake, there was dancing, there was everything you could think of that you might want in a great wedding. And after that, there was the wedding night. I'm not going to go into details, but suffice to say, it did not go entirely how the prince had imagined it might. And he got quite the education. He was lying there afterwards, staring at the ceiling, and the false bride was propped up on the pillows, puffing away on a cigarette. "All right, lover, I need a favour. The maid I came with, I've got plenty now, find us some other work." And the prince, he said, "Oh, yes, I think we've got a vacancy with the geese or something like that." And that is how the princess became the Goose Girl. Every morning she would rise earlier than anyone else in the castle, and she would go out and she would herd those geese up to a faraway field, come rain or shine, come wind or snow. And there she would sit and watch them while they ate the good green grass. And when the sun began to lower itself on the horizon, she would have to round them all up, which is quite a job if you've ever met any geese, and drive them all back to the castle. It was hard work, and her skin grew red and trapped, but she did her best. And now that she was taken care of, there was just one tiny hole in the false bride's plans, which I'm sure you can guess what it is. Falada, the talking horse. And so again, after another night, when the prince lay there next to her and she puffed on a cigar she'd upgraded, "I need another favour. You know that horse I rode in on?" "Oh, yes," the prince rallied a little. "I remember the horse. I want you to take it out the knackers and get it killed. It gave me no end of trouble." And the prince protested because, as I said, he loved his horses, but with honeyed words and subtle threats, the false bride span him round and around until at last he agreed. Now the Goose Girl, she caught wind of what was going to happen. And so she went to the knacker and she begged that he might bring her the head of Falada when the deed was done. And although it was a slightly strange request, the knacker was fond of the Goose Girl by this point, and he agreed. And the next morning, a grey, bleak kind of morning, the knacker took Falada out to a faraway field, away from the other horses where the scent of blood or the screams couldn't spook them. And as he looked at Falada, Falada opened his mouth and he looked back at the way he'd come. And he said nothing, holding his silence for now. And with one great blow of his steel axe, the last of the talking horses was gone. The knacker was as good as his word. He picked up the head, he had it cleaned and stuffed, and he gave it to the Goose Girl, who mounted it on an arch, which she would pass under every morning. So early that no one was around to see, as she said, "Oh, Falada, Falada, thou art dead, and all the joy in my life has fled." And Falada, because he still had some magic, even now would reply, Princess, if only your mother knew, her loving heart would break in two. And then the princess would herd the geese up to the field, and the day would begin. Now, she wasn't the only goose person in this castle. There was a goose boy called Conrad. And Conrad, well, he quite liked the goose girl. He thought she was quite cool. And the thing he liked most of all was when she would sit while the geese ran around and she would comb her long golden hair. Conrad thought, oh, I do like that. Oh, I like that very much. I want to touch it. I'm going to touch it. And he would come up. And the goose girl was learning by this point. She was getting a little older, a little cannier, and she wasn't having any of this. So she would sing. She would sing to the wind. Wind, wind, wind. Wind, please take Conrad's hat and blow it around the field so that he chases it all afternoon and he will leave me alone. Wind. And the wind heard. And the wind had sympathy, and the wind agreed. And with a gust, it stole Conrad's hat. And every time the boy got close, another gust would pick it up and put it just a little further out of reach, so he was running around all afternoon. And the goose girl sat and combed her golden hair. At the end of the day, Conrad was hot and bothered and kind of miffed. He began to think, as this went on and on and on, day after day after day, that there was something just a little bit funny about the goose girl. So he decided to play amateur detective time. He followed her home. And then, when he didn't discover anything there, he decided to be there when she came out in the morning, and so hiding away, he saw as she came out and said, "Falada, Falada, thou art dead, and all the joy in my life is fled." And he saw as Falada replied, "Princess, if only your mother knew, her loving heart would break in two." Aha! Thought Conrad, got it! And after the day's goose herding was done, he went to the king, because the king would allow anyone to approach him for 1 hour in the evening with any kind of problem, and he would do his best to fix it. So Conrad strode up to the king. "My liege, I am not tending geese with that girl any longer. Not only does she sing to the wind, not only does my hat mysteriously get blown around the field all day, but she talks to a dead horse's head, and it talks back." "Well, what do they say?" said the king, slightly intrigued. "Oh, well, she says, 'Falada, Falada, thou art dead, and all the joy in my life is fled.' And it says, 'Oh, princess, if only your mother knew, your loving heart would break in two.' I mean, who calls a goose girl princess, I ask you?" "Leave it with me," said the king. And later that evening he went out and he found the goose girl and he said, "My lady, I fear a grave injustice may have taken place. Tell me your story. What has happened to you?" And the goose girl opened her mouth and she couldn't say a word. "I can't," she said. I can't tell anyone, any living soul under the bright blue sky." "Very well," said the king. "Come with me." And he took her to the tertiary kitchen, which was only used on high days and holidays. And he opened the doors of one of those cold, cold ovens and said, "Go in there and tell your story to the corner of the oven." And the goose girl looked at the king, and the king looked at the goose girl, and for the first time in a long time, a little spark of light came into her eyes as she crawled in, and the king secreted himself in the hinge of that door, and the words began to spill from the goose girl at last, all about her mother and her betrothal and the maid and the betrayal. And when she was done, she came out and she felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said to the king. The king ordered that a feast take place the very next day, and he dressed the Goose Girl in beautiful, beautiful silks, festooned her with jewellery so that no one would recognise her, and sat her at his right hand. And when everyone was done eating and drinking, he stood up and he said, "Now I will tell you a story, because who doesn't like a story after a feast?" And of course everyone agreed with him, because he was the king after all. And the king told the story of a young woman betrayed by her companion, much as I have told you, and the Goose Girl had told the other. And at the end, he looked around and he said, "What would be such a suitable fate for such a vile betrayer?" And the false bride leapt to her feet, because she was so immersed in her role, she'd forgotten even the story of her own life. "Oh, me, pick me! Right, nothing is too bad for her. What I do is I think she should be stuffed in a barrel, and long nails should be hammered in, and then she should be rolled over and over and over until there's nothing left." And the king looked at her, possibly even with a little pity in his eye, and said, "Even now you could have chosen differently. But as you have spoken, so it shall be. You've pronounced your own sentence." And the guards seized her, and they stuffed her into a barrel, and those long iron nails were hammered all the way in. And then behind two horses she was rolled up and down the streets, which got redder and redder and redder. And when they took the lid off, there was nothing left but a bloody, bloody pulp. Now after something like that, there's only one thing you can do, and that is have a wedding. A second wedding. The prince and the princess stood in front of the priest, and it was as if they were seeing each other for the first time. And they fell deeply, deeply in love, almost as if they'd met somewhere in the seventh highest heaven beforehand. The wedding was a little simpler than the previous one. They were a little older and hopefully a little wiser. But it was nonetheless magnificent. And the king looked at them and saw that the kingdom would be in good hands, so he decided to step back and enjoy a well-earned retirement. So the prince and the princess became the king and the queen in their own right. And they ruled wisely and well from that day forward for the rest of their long, happy lives.